And the reason he had the title was because he was an up-and-coming Atlanta hip-hop artist. Over the last 2.5 years, I've told a lot of car stories, but if I'm honest, I think my favorite one is the first one we ever aired back in June of 2017 when we launched the VINwiki YouTube channel. Our first story was the McLaren F1 maintenance nightmares, but the first one from me was the story when my wife bought a Ferrari. And I love that story. I love what it meant. I love where it kind of set me up in terms of flipping cars and buying cars. And I love how much it helped my wife to understand this ridiculous hobby. But it's honestly also where the phrase shrewd negotiator really started. And I don't know that it ever even would have caught on if it hadn't been that on that first day of recording, I told the prostitute Lamborghini story last. And I was so tired after telling, 10 stories that day that I couldn't think of another way to make fun of someone for weak negotiation due to lack of skill and lack of leverage than calling them facetiously a shrewd negotiator. And so this story, I guess it happened back probably in mid to late 2009. And I had just gotten married. My wife was teaching elementary school at a local public school. And I had the exotic car rental company that I at that point had been running for probably like 3 years. And honestly, I was broke most of the time. I remember looking at my bank account at the end of some months and having less than $10, because I had probably $10,000 in car payments, and the business was working and the model was generally as sound as an exotic car rental business can be, but it was a tough way to make money then. It still is now, but even back then you could charge much higher percentages or rates relative to what a car might be worth. And I had a couple Ferraris and a Lamborghini and some Mercedes and stuff like that, but the fleet was not that big and also not always that busy. When people think about the exotic car rental business, they think, oh, I'm gonna get the cars out 15, 20 days a month. And that really wasn't it. I mean, if they were out 6, 7, 8 days a month, that was great, especially if it was anywhere near kind of the retail price. We had done a lot of things to discount rentals, sold Groupons. That's really how I funded the replacement of the Gallardo's motor, because at that point I had no money when it blew up, I guess back in 2007. So it had been a bumpy road. And of course, my wife's appetite for the whole world of exotic cars at that point was really, really thin, because the week before our wedding, the Ferrari had been stolen, the Lamborghini had been crashed by the same renter, and that was an utter nightmare that we very much could have just been completely wiped out financially for. So I was really looking for an opportunity to kind of make her understand there's so many great things that happen when you buy terrible examples of exotic cars and you own and use them. And so I had developed a reputation amongst kind of the Atlanta dealership scene as a guy who would buy terrible examples with a lot of needs, a lot of hairy deals on derelict exotic cars. And obviously I still have that reputation. I still love them. I still love getting those calls when somebody's like, Ed, I have a car that sounds like you. And that was a joke at the dealership when I eventually went to work there, that, oh, that's an Ed Bolian car. Not something you'd ever want for inventory, not something a rational person would buy, but something that has a ton of reasons why it should be cheap. It's probably not cheap enough, if we're honest, but Ed will write a check for it. And so it was kind of known. I'd been shopping for different cars. At that time, I had 2 Ferrari 360s that I'd had in the exotic car rental fleet. So I got a call from Ferrari of Atlanta, and they said, Ed, we've got a 360 coupe here that we think you might want. And I was like, I'm sure I do. Tell me more about it. They said, well, it was brought in here a few months ago, and it's owned by this guy who's local, but it was with his parents in northern Florida. And I guess the battery had been dead because they didn't drive it, which is a tendency of Ferraris. And so they had gone to jump it off. And I guess they had reversed the leads on the battery, and in doing so had just blown all of the control modules, most of the electronics in the car. And so the car wouldn't start. It had been towed in, and they had diagnosed it and been authorized to go ahead and start on the repairs, and had done some of them. But when they started getting close to the end and estimating what the total bill was going to be, the owner had said, you know what, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to afford that. And this was not going to be the kind of bill where they would want a mechanics lien a car where somebody was going to give the car up. He just literally didn't have the cash to afford it. Something I could certainly relate to in that chapter of life. And so they were like, look, we'd like to give you his number because he does have the title. And that's kind of a novelty, because in most cases, if you can't afford the service bill, you probably have a gigantic loan. So like if one of my cars that I had tons of negative equity in had some catastrophic maintenance event that I couldn't afford, it wouldn't matter if somebody wanted to buy it for what it was actually worth. I couldn't sell it because I couldn't write the check for the negative equity. But this guy did have the title. And so they asked if they could give him my phone number. And he called like 10 minutes later. And the reason he had the title was because he was an up-and-coming Atlanta hip-hop artist. And at his burgeoning rap career, he had been gifted this Ferrari 360 Modena by T-Pain. I guess he'd signed to his label or management. I don't know how it works, but he had this car, the title, and I guess he never really drove it. And I don't think his career ever really took off. So this was honestly kind of the only thing he had to show for his career in the music industry. And he desperately wanted out of it, and the Ferrari of Atlanta guys desperately wanted their service bill paid by the end of the month, which was coming up just a few days from then. So time was kind of the essence, and he knew what they were generally worth at the time. Of course, this was in 2009, really the bottom of the Great Recession, probably as bad as the US economy had been since the Great Depression. So all exotic cars had depreciated just catastrophically, especially when you saw guys like VINwiki negatively impacting the market by just dumping tons of inventory out and getting super lowball bids from so many people. So you could barely sell nice exotic cars late in 2009. When I started at the dealership, which was honestly just a few months after this, they'd only sold 5 new Lamborghinis that whole year. And at the end of the time I was there, we were selling 60, 70, 80 new Lamborghinis a year. So times were as bad as they ever got for nice examples of exotic cars. So something like this, you really couldn't sell. Ferrari of Atlanta certainly didn't want it for inventory. Their used car manager had looked it over and just said, look, if you can find a wholesaler or anything, let them have it. I don't want it. Because when you have a car like this that's been sitting, especially for as long as it has been, and it has all these obstacles to even start, you don't know what's going to happen next. And we knew the car was probably about due for the dreaded Ferrari timing belt change that the early cars needed. And it was an early 360, kind of unremarkable. It was silver Argento Nürburgring with the Nero interior black, Daytona seats, rear challenge grille, red calipers, but honestly, just kind of a run-of-the-mill early 360. So the car was probably 160 grand new. Of course, there was waiting list and massive premiums in 99, 2001. But now it was probably worth 75, 80 grand. And the owner of the car knew this. He had gone out to DuPont Registry or Auto Tempest, wherever he was looking for cars, and knew that that's about what they would bring. And he knew what he was supposed to pay Ferrari of Atlanta, $9,000 or $10,000 to get this car back. And he could not do that. So he's like, all right, well, maybe I'll discount it a little bit more than that. He really wanted $60,000 for this car. And I knew that I wasn't bidding against anybody else. And in those kind of circumstances where you're the only person willing to buy a car without a PPI, without any conditions, without any required financing, you can really hit them pretty low. And so I told him, no, I think your car's worth $30,000. And of course, he was a shrewd negotiator. So after a bit of back and forth, we met right smack dab in the middle at $31,000. And he was just happy to have it out. I mean, I got whatever he was going to use with that money. The problem was I did not have $31,000, and certainly in the way that I'd agreed to do the deal, I could not go get a loan for it, and I was probably tapped out on the loan front at that point anyway in my life with all the rental car loans. But my wife had some money. We'd both been able to go to college in Georgia for free. If you kept decent grades, you got the Hope Scholarship, and she'd worked through summers and saved very well. We lived very modestly despite having a bunch of nice cars. We lived in a very cheap apartment, and we never had the money to spend, to be quite honest. I wasn't paying myself honestly much of any salary, and we were just barely getting by. But she had this kind of put away that she thought she'd never touch until retirement. Certainly the last thing she ever imagined she would do with it was buy another Ferrari for our family. But I convinced her that this was a terrific idea, the safest of investments, even though I knew there were so many things that could happen once we spent this $9,000 or $10,000 to get the car running, that we could then be like, oh, darn it, we've got to buy a shift actuator or all these things. And I had used those, fears, obviously, as leverage to negotiate stuff to make this guy scared to ever touch the car again. But I was obviously kind of shielding her from those concerns. And so I pay Ferrari their money for the service ticket so they can put it in their month, get it over with. And a few days later, it's ready to pick up. And quite honestly, the car was terrific. It drove great. I love 360s. You think 99, I was 14 years old. So as I was most impressionable when this car came out, I just absolutely love 360s. I'm not sure any car could be fundamentally more beautiful to me than a 360 is, because when I first started to love cars, I remember loving 360s. And it was always the dream. It was, I'm not sure, it wasn't the main reason I started the rental car company, was to one day own a Ferrari 360. So I loved the one that I had, but I didn't really need another one. So we rented it a couple times, took it to some events, and just drove it around a little bit because it was nice to have one. I think it had 22,000 miles at the time, and really didn't need any imminent service, but nothing else really broke. So there were a couple cosmetic things that we cleaned up, and eventually, after I went to work at Lamborghini Atlanta, I kind of started the process of liquidating all the cars, and it was the first one to go. I sold it to a wholesaler in Texas, actually for 60,000 bucks. So 31 for the car, 9 or so for the repairs, a couple other things, had about 40 grand in it, and made a nice little 20. And it was perfect, and it's one of the reasons I love the story so much is that it's really why my wife began to tolerate exotic cars, because this was a terrific outcome. She was very relieved when that check deposited into our account and her precious savings were restored, and I don't think we touched it again until we very much needed it for a down payment on a house soon after that. So it was one of those great moments that could have gone very, very badly, and the odds were certainly that they would go badly, but in all the years of buying a lot of cars like that, I think the only one that ever really bit me was the Range Rover that I bought for her years later in the same way, very blind, knowing it was a low offer, knowing that things could go wrong, and something did go wrong, but fortunately, I guess it ended about as well as it could. But that was a great one. The car was awesome. I think I ever heard from the guy again. He might have called me wanting like an M5 or M6 a few years later, but I ended up selling T-Pain the orange Gallardo Spider that he ended up trading on his Veyron while I was working at Motor Cars of Georgia, and I mentioned this, and he was like, "Oh, I remember that car, that was awesome." I don't know why he never drove it, but I'm sure he wished he had, because if Mom and Dad hadn't jumped it backwards, I'm sure he would have had many more trouble-free miles. This month's car stories are sponsored by The Ridge. The Ridge makes a line of wallets and bags that are designed to be minimalist and help us just take with us the things we actually need. So check out the link in the description below for a discount and buy one for yourself, or they make great Christmas presents. And be sure to let them know how thankful you are for their support of VINwiki.